Hey, we're back. We're back for another episode of the Always About People show. And this time, I'm not by myself. Welcome my friend, partner, Rick Hasty to the conversation. We've got a good one today. Rick, before we even get started on the show, I do have to ask a question. The title slide for today's show, it looks like you are so angry at the next generation. Could you explain that? I mean, see,
Um, yes, I can explain that. I don't know what I was thinking about in that picture, but I love the next generation.
yeah. So maybe that's a great place to start. Obviously, the title today, Unlocking Potential and Purpose in the Next Generation, because as we work with clients across the country, we're hearing some themes. Both of us are speaking and regularly interacting with leaders, and we'll hear these themes like the next generation, they're so entitled, they're less productive, they're less committed to my organization. They have so many unrealistic expectations. They don't stick around. They're always looking for something bigger and better. They started yesterday and they want to be the CEO tomorrow.
Right.
And it feels like we're hearing this from leaders, and it's leading to a belief about this generation, which might lead to people's faces looking like yours on the title slide. Um, but
We got to change that title slide, Chris.
yeah, as we get started, I want to welcome everybody back to the show. As all of you are aware, on the show here, we try to cover topics and ideas and concepts that are really practical, that leaders and organizations are dealing with, particularly around people. And so our hope today is that we would be able to bring up a concept of this next generation, but not just leave you hanging, but leave you with a few practical thoughts on how you can engage, motivate, really unlock the potential of this next generation, Gen Z and millennials. We'll get into that in a minute. But for those of you who are watching live, we encourage you to dialogue with us, send comments, thoughts, reactions, ask questions. And if you happen to be watching this after the fact as a recording, we would still love to get to any comments and thoughts that you have. All right. With that said, Rick, let's jump straight in. I think, we're hearing this stuff about the next generation. And I'd like to just ask you, do you think it's fair?
Well, it might be helpful to start with, what is the Gen Z generation? Who are we talking about? And generally speaking, let's say an acceptable definition is the 35 and under crowd. And so we got to be a little bit careful because a 34-year-old who's married with children might have a very different point of view than a 22-year-old who's started their very, very first job. So what we're going to make some generalities, I think, and we're going to categorize some groups of people: Gen Zers, millennials, Gen X, and maybe even have a quick conversation around baby boomers. But they are generalizations, and you do see some of these tendencies beginning to show up in millennials that we now talk about in Gen Zers. And of course, there might even be some new things emerging with Gen Zers too. So we have to be a little careful. But I do think that what we're beginning to see, what we have established with Gen Zers, is this is the new generation, and we see things there, by the way, that have been true of every generation. Some new ways of thinking, some new maybe talents and skills that are already perfected in that generation, that weren't so perfected in the millennials, but were beginning to emerge. And then, of course, there'll be another generation behind them one day.
Yeah. So I think just to put dates for people, generally accepted, the millennials were born 1980 to 1996, which means that Gen Z follows. So call it 1997 through current. And now there are even people thinking through, all right, what's the next generation? And what do we do about them? So if millennials, the oldest millennials would be 42 years old this year in 2022.
Mhm.
When people refer to the next generation, sometimes they'll think, well, they're the millennials. And yet
Right.
you've got late 30s, early 40s that would be a part of the millennial generation. Gen Z would now be, let's say, the oldest would be 26, kind of mid 20s. And so as we talk about these topics, let's, you said generalities, generalizations.
Mhm.
We'll do our best to put these categories together. But I guess now that we've talked about who they are, do you still think it's fair that we talk about them this way?
Yeah, I didn't mean to quite skip your question there, other than to say there are certainly things that are fair to generalize, but you got to be careful when it comes to individuals. And I think that one thing that it's fair about the younger generation we call Gen Zers is they tend to be more mobile, and they tend to be, certainly surveys show that younger generation is far more likely to leave in the next year. 68% or so of them say they expect to leave in the next year. And so that creates a concern that we should have about those Gen Zers, because we don't want to spend a lot of time replacing our good employees, even if they are younger and maybe have some different expectations.
Okay, so we've got this mobile generation. They're on the move. And as a company, I'm spending money on recruiting, sourcing, onboarding, training, developing. And we've heard it from leaders. Why would I go about spending all of this money, these resources, if I know that a good majority of them are going to be leaving? And maybe that leads to the question of like, okay, is there anything that I can do about this mobile generation?
Yeah, and Chris, it's pretty obvious I'm not a Gen Zer, but it doesn't mean I don't love that generation and really want to engage with them in a way uh, that enables them to be everything they can be. And so they've grown up with a different set of inputs than I did. And we've coined the phrase the pre-wired generation. And I think that what that's reflective of is that this is a generation that didn't know life without cell phones, and many of them, even when they were younger, we see 10-year-olds walking around with cell phones today. Well, that's the generation that started that, and so they literally have been connected their entire life. And so I think one thing that sets them apart is that they are totally uncomfortable if they're not connected.
Hmm.
And so the irony in that, and I think that leads to the number two item, is that while they're pre wired and connected in the technology sense, um, they also feel less connected to family and friends than any other generation before them.
Hmm.
And the interesting thing there is that has created in them a desire for purpose, and in a sense, being connected to something greater than themselves than maybe any previous generation.
Wow. Okay, so let's recap that as a thought. And to our friend Jack, we can get a transcript, but this will also be recorded. So if you're missing this or have to skip out, you can always go back and watch it again. But what I would just say is, you mentioned a few really important things. This is the, let's call it the pre-wired generation.
Mhm.
They were born into a world of cell phones. They are constantly connected. The examples would be my own kids who are regularly texting with somebody who might be in the room next door or in the car next to them
Mhm.
or whatever that might be. They're constantly connected. They're connected to one another virtually through social media, through whatever app they're using to communicate, because it does regularly change. And yet the most important thing you said was, while they're connected technologically, they're losing connection relationally.
Right. Right. We see that in a lot of different ways, for sure. I mean, an example, I know I shared this picture with you recently, Chris, as I walked into a cafe just before they were about to start work, and there were eight teenagers sitting around a table. And as you recall the picture, Chris, every one of them were looking at a phone, and and no two of them were talking with each other. Although I suspect, I don't think this is illogical, that they might easily have been talking to each other through text on their phones when they were in proximity within a few feet of each other. And that's become pretty common to that generation.
Yeah. So I think the conversation that we wanted to set up is, hey, there are two priorities that are really different in this generation, the next generation. One being purpose, and two being technology. We've already kind of lightly addressed these. We've said, hey, this is the pre-wired generation. They were born into this thing. Technology is just something that we're going to have to deal with. But their connection technologically has led to maybe a disconnection relationally. And so, as leaders that are watching this, or colleagues that are watching this, they're trying to figure out, how do we work well with this next generation? How do we unlock their potential and their purpose? How do we help them learn, grow, be motivated in the workplace? And so maybe we can go back to those two thoughts, because while those priorities may be slightly different, there may be a way that we can encourage leaders to capitalize on those differences to actually create a workplace where these individuals of the next generation are performing at high levels, are thriving, are flourishing, are becoming the best versions of themselves. Would you agree?
I totally agree. And I would start by saying that through education and through experience, this is the most talented generation of the last 50 years. And I would say that what you see there are people, we call the millennials, native digital generation. And yet the Gen Zers take that to another level altogether. We talk about cell phones as being connected, but everything they touch is connected. That the Internet of Things has taken over. So whether it's their refrigerator, whether it's their automobile, whether it's their electric bike, their e-bike, they're all connected. They step onto a treadmill, it's connected. And so everything about them is connected. And so in the workplace, they expect that same kind of connection. And while connection certainly means ability to, let's say, use applications to talk to people, it also really means an environment in which they are technologically comfortable. And so keep in mind, when you bring them a Gen Zer into your office, they've probably spent the last 10 years with not one screen, but two screens. Many of them gaming, many of them even talking to friends by, of course, a video. But in that environment, they're using state of the art. And so if you're expecting them to look at a green screen, I was in a store just the other day and I saw the millennial behind the counter looking at a green screen. And you're going, that's not a millennial. I mean, a Gen Zer. That's not a Gen Zer that's going to stay there very long. That, of course, I think most of the executives that might be looking at this are seeing dollar signs. And I think some of that is true, but you at least have to paint a picture of where they're moving forward and moving into a technology environment they're comfortable with.
Yeah. So let's recap that, and then we'll get to this great question here. But I think the thought is a couple things being different in this next generation. One of them being technology. while they are connected at all times and all places, we have to ask ourselves as leaders of organizations, have we created an environment for this generation to work that is keeping up with their understanding of technology, that is technologically advanced enough for them to be engaged in a screen? And so there are all kinds of tools, from messaging platforms to the way we communicate, to solutions for collaboration, which leads into our new hybrid work environments and remote environments. How do we create team environments through the use of technology that is actually engaging this generation? And so I think what you're saying is, even though there might be a fear from an executive of, gosh, what's that going to cost me? The real question might be, if you don't address it and you don't improve technology, what's it cost you in the attrition and turnover of your workforce?
Well, it's very expensive. Turnover is tremendously expensive. Some surveys show that that the average worker, losing the average worker, has a cost of about $200,000 a year. Now, that may not be true of your Gen Zer who only started a year ago, but it will still be very significant. As you think about productivity, as you think about the amount of time it takes to hire somebody, train them, and then the 6 months or so on the average it takes for someone to become productive in their job, and oftentimes longer than that. And so the cost of turnover is very, very high, and oftentimes unaccounted for. But the issue there is that with the Gen Zer, technology matters. It certainly matters for them in the sense of being connected to the things they're used to being connected to. So it's not just technology, but it's also the access to how they communicate, how they engage with others. At the same time, I think there's an opportunity to engage with Gen Zers. Remember, we're generalizing. And so individuals are impacted by what matters to them most. And I would say that as leaders and managers of Gen Zers, that that engaging with them personally is very powerful, particularly if you think about this connectedness and disconnectedness, that the opportunity lies there to take them beyond their technology connectedness and connect with them personally. And the more you can create environments in where personal relationships matter, the more you'll actually engage a Gen Zer. And frankly, you'll see great results in terms of their willingness to stay in their role.
Yeah. Okay. So a couple differences: purpose, technology. To our leaders, practically, be looking at what technology you have available to this generation, because they will be connected at all times. However, also be aware of the personal connection, because the one-on-one personal connection with this generation is really, really vital. And I would say that that leads perfectly into circling back to this idea around purpose, which is,
Right.
how do we improve or increase purpose for this next generation? And on one level, we could go back to, it's through that personal relationship, through that one-on-one connectedness between people. But maybe I'll just ask the question that might be on somebody's mind. Is it enough to just have a purpose statement, a mission of an organization? Is that what connects people to purpose?
Well, again, the surveys are showing that Gen Zers, more than any other generation, really care about working for a company that has a purpose that aligns with them. I think some companies are making mistakes, though, and we're seeing this again with turnover numbers. That purpose is some grandiose, let's boil the ocean type of statement. And yet, what we do know is that what everyone wants is to be engaging in the workplace with a purpose that they can impact. And so if your purpose statement is let's boil the ocean, I don't know how you communicate to the individual employee that the efforts they undertake every day is boiling the ocean. But if your purpose statement is really focused on what's important to your customers and how your service or your product is changing their lives, then you really have the opportunity to now engage the worker in a way in which they understand what they contribute every day is actually impacting the life of your customers. And that really is now engaging them on a personal level.
Yeah, no, that's great. I actually had an example just this last week. I was working with a company, and they happen to be in an industry where there are a number of younger workers that sit behind a computer screen. It's a lot of paperwork. It's a lot of filing. It's a lot of making sure that they have what they need to get a task done. And so you can imagine that a number of these people might not be connected with the actual customer or see the value of their work directly. And so, you could have a mission statement in place, you could have a purpose in place, and you could say, well, hey, you should find purpose in your work because this is what we believe as an organization. However, last week when I was on site with them, they did an event on Thursday night, and everybody from the organization got to go participate. And as a result, these individuals who were normally behind a computer screen, kind of checking tasks off a list, were able to put faces and names with the people that they impact every day. And
Wow.
the interaction was incredible. I think the response from employees was incredible to just see that, oh, so when I'm behind my computer screen engaging with technology, these are the actual lives of people who are being impacted. And that's just the really practical application of tying purpose to work. One other thing that I thought about while you were talking is actually Jack sent in a thought, and he said, to what extent is it an advantage to give these different generations the ability to identify and solve problems with a high degree of autonomy? And what I was thinking as you were talking is another way to tie purpose to work is to give people some level of autonomy in their work. Like out of the Industrial Revolution, some of Frederick Winslow Taylor basically said the workers do the working, the managers do the thinking. And so if as a manager, I do all the thinking and just tell you what to do and then stand over you as you do it, and then apply some new technological advances to track your mouse movement and whether you're at your desk or not, I'm really not giving you any ability or autonomy to think through your role, how to solve problems, how to actually engage with a customer. And so one just quick thought, and then I'd love your response, Rick, would be, how do I as a leader give some level of autonomy? How do I set clear expectations, but allow the person the autonomy to feel purpose in their work?
Well, I think Jack brings up a really good point that you're making there. That if you think about that pre-wired generation, that they've had a lot of autonomy, and that's part of feeling a bit disconnected. But it also really equips them to work alone very well. But working alone really requires a great understanding of what it is that certainly your purpose is, but also to understand what the expectations that a leader has of you. And as you know, Chris, we often talk about a model of leadership around care and clarity. And the care part certainly is about understanding who people are and what their skills and what their strengths are. And the clarity part is about communicating clearly what your expectations are. And when you do that, particularly for a Gen Zer who does value autonomy, you're really giving them the tools they need, the understanding they need to work independently And here is where you really tap into their expertise. And
Mm.
it's why you have the opportunity with those Gen Zers to frankly utilize their greatest strengths to enable your organization to deliver what they're called on to deliver.
Mm.
And frankly takes you away from thinking Gen Zers are maybe a lesser generation and realizing that they're actually a greater generation.
All right. So let's circle back because before we finish, we had an incredible comment from a LinkedIn user I want to get back to, but let's recap this. We said, hey, there are two distinctives in this next generation: purpose, technology. While this generation, let's call them the pre-wired generation, they're connected at all times. How do we engage them, motivate them, unlock their potential? Well, let's make sure that we're thinking through what technological platforms we have for them to connect. But let's also not forget the importance of personal connection, particularly one-on-one. Then when it
Right.
comes to purpose, it's not enough to just have a purpose statement or a mission statement. We have to figure out how to connect people's individual roles to the purpose of an organization. We have to figure out how to connect them to an impact with a customer. And then we have to figure out how we set very clear expectations for them to have a level of autonomy in their role, so they feel some
Right.
level of ownership. Because, Rick, you did say this is the most talented generation of the last 50 years. And the key would be, instead of us throwing around unfair generalizations about how unproductive or lack of commitment or entitlement or whatever we want to say about this generation, what if instead we believed they are the most talented generation? What are the things that I need to do differently? And so I'd like to finish our conversation with a comment from a LinkedIn user who just reached out and said, hey, Chris and Rick, great discussion. How do you think the economic situation of our country plays into their psyche? Over the last decade, we've seen a lot of growth and opportunity for jumping between jobs to increase pay and responsibility. How will this change in a potential recession or recessionary environment when opportunities are reduced? Any thoughts on that, Rick?
Well, I'll quickly say that what we called the Great Recession for a couple of years, in some ways, became the Great Bust. And what I mean by that is that while 80% of the people left to join another job because of pay, more than half of them have decided that they didn't make a good move. And that's because they realized that pay's not all that we often think it is. And it can be attractive at first, but it's not what keeps people at jobs. And so I think that the good news is that even with an economic downturn, that there have been lessons learned across the board that just making money is not necessarily everything you want in a job. And so there's the opportunity, I think, in this downturn to see security where you are, certainly to work hard. And I think if employers treat their Gen Zers effectively, that frankly, they're paying them less than a lot of their other workers, and they can expect more productivity.
Yeah. I love that. I think as I was thinking about what I would comment on, I would say, I do think that the economic situation plays into the psyche of human beings. I
Right.
think it creates fear, anxiety, some insecurities. When people saw that there were a lot of opportunities, and pardon the pun, but they saw green and then they realized it wasn't greener.
Right.
And now a lot of them, or a significant amount of them, want to boomerang back. But now we're looking at least the fear of a recession. And I do think that people will tend to stay put a little bit more. That doesn't mean that they're enjoying their role. That doesn't mean that you're unlocking their potential and their purpose. It just means that they're staying put. And
Right.
so I think what we would say to leaders, to organizations, is take this as an opportunity to really create a culture and an environment where you're connecting people in one-on-one relationships, where you're evaluating your technological platforms, and ultimately where you're tying individuals to purpose in their work, where
Right.
you're tying their role back to who they're serving, their customer, how their role impacts the organization. And so I think, yes, I'm not really sure how this is going to change as a result of our pressures on the economy, but as opportunities are reduced, I think people will stay put. But as leaders, we need to use this as an opportunity to make some improvements in our organizations that truly unlock potential and purpose in this next generation. Rick,
That's right, Chris.
any
Thank you,
parting
Chris.
thoughts?
No, good summary there. And I think the great news is we have a very, very talented generation in Gen Zers. Now we, us older folks, need to figure out how to engage them in a way that we allow them to reach their full potential.
All right. And with that, I think we'll wrap it. That was another episode of the Always About People show. And I just want to remind you, this topic was about unlocking potential and purpose in this next generation, because we believe that this is one of the most talented generations that we've seen in a long time. If that's what we believe, we'll do whatever it takes to help them, to motivate, to help them grow, to help them learn. And so I hope that you were able to take away a couple practical things or thoughts today. Thanks to those of you who sent in comments and questions. We appreciate it. It's so much more fun to be in a dialogue than just a monologue. Rick, thanks for being in this with me. Appreciate you. And to those of you who watch faithfully, like, subscribe. It helps us get the message out, because we're all about creating cultures where people thrive. Until next time, we'll see you then.